Before we start, I would like to read the synopsis of this webinar. So this webinar is about the climate finance, which is an emerging research discipline dealing with the study of global, national, or regional financing of public and private investments that aims to support mitigation and adaptation action that will address climate change. So in general, our topic this morning is about the climate change, and specifically, this webinar will Professor Stefan Trueck will provide the result of 2 studies related to research in climate finance. The first one examines the impact of voluntary carbon disclosures and their quality on the subsequent environmental performance of firms. And the second one is about the solar power purchase agreement, or PPA, as financial instrument to increase investment into small-scale renewable energy generation. But because we only have a very limited time, then this webinar today or this morning would in general cover the first topic. It's about the voluntary carbon disclosure, and maybe the second one will be touched by Professor Trueck a bit, and we will talk about this in the next webinar that will be organized. And please let me introduce our guest speaker this morning. Our speaker this morning is Professor Stefan Trueck. He is a professor of finance at the Faculty of Business and Economics, Macquarie University, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia, and also a researcher at the Center for Risk Analytics, Macquarie University. Professor Stefan Trueck holds a PhD in Business Engineering from Karlsruhe Institute of Technology in Germany, and he has a research area that focuses on risk management, financial econometrics, and business analytics, including the field of energy and commodity markets, credit risk, operational risk, emission trading, international financial market, real estate, finance, and the economics of climate change. And he has a very strong research portfolio. Stefan has a strong research portfolio and has published or forthcoming papers in international high impact journal, including Journal of Banking and Finance, Energy Economics, European Journal of Operation Research, Global Environmental Change, Conservation Biology, Journal of Portfolio Management, Journal of Future Markets, Computer and Operation Research, Economic Report, Australia, Journal of Credit Risk and Studies on Nonlinear Dynamics and Econometrics. That is our distinguished speaker this morning. And the rules for the webinar this morning, please use the background. I think we skip this. Please mute your microphone during the presentation. And if you have any question related to the topic today, please use the chat to send your question. Then I will read the question at the end of the presentation. And all the participants will get certificate from us, informing about your attendance in this webinar. And for the purpose of the certificate, please fill out the attendance form. The link will be distributed in the chat. And we record the webinar and save the presentation. Everything will be available later on. So that's that is the information about our speaker this morning and the role. And I think we start the webinar straight away. Professor Stefan, whenever you're ready, you can start the presentation.
All right. Thank you very much for the nice introduction. Great pleasure to present today. And as it was already pointed out, I decided, to split these talks into 2 sessions. So talking a little bit about climate finance today, and then one study that is related to voluntary carbon disclosures. And we'll have another seminar, maybe in April or May. I'll have to determine that then deals with these power purchase agreements and solar residential combinations of battery and solar panels, and it's also a very interesting topic. So I hope I'll see you back then, but today it will be about the predictive value of voluntary carbon disclosures. As I said, I'm very glad to present here. It's always good to see an old friend, and Rudi and I have been playing football together for many years while Rudi was at Macquarie University, Sydney, and so I was very honored when I was invited to present. So looking forward to this. I'm happy to take questions during the talk generally, but with the chat function I might not see it. So let's see how we're going. Okay, I'll start. Can you see the slides and they've been moving forward? Just a quick check, yeah. Thumbs up if that, yeah, okay. So today the outline, and if anything, if you can't see the slides, because it has happened recently to me that my students didn't tell me for half an hour that they could not see the slides. So we want to avoid that, yeah. If you can't see them, please let me know. So, okay, I'll start with a bit of a motivation for this topic. Talking a little bit about climate finance and these voluntary disclosures. There's some theories why companies are willing or maybe not so willing to disclose. Then we'll have a look at the actual carbon disclosure project, and I'll tell you a little bit about what we did, because we were looking at these reports and we were trying to squeeze out information from these reports that might, what we call indicate impression management. So maybe firms are basically trying to look good while actually they are not necessarily doing so well in terms of their environmental performance. And then we're having a look at, was the carbon disclosure basically what these companies wrote and the score they got, was that really meaningful in terms of their environmental performance 1 year later? And then I'll show you the results of the empirical analysis and the conclusions. Okay, so very briefly, I think the motivation for this topic is relatively easy. Of course, we have an increasing importance of corporate social reporting and voluntary carbon disclosures for all industries. Yeah, of course, even more for the energy industry or utilities. And manufacturing industry, but overall it has become very important for companies to show that they're doing something to reduce their emissions. So the question, does it pay to be green? And the corresponding link between environmental and corporate financial performance has been extensively in the focus of business and environmental research. So we're not the first ones to look at that, but we're looking at it a little bit from a different perspective. So far, relatively little research on the effects of carbon disclosure on the subsequent financial and environmental performance has been done, especially not in a way that looking at the details of the report and using some text mining or business analytics techniques to get additional information out of these reports. And that's what we're doing here. Okay, as I said, motivation is probably relatively easy. We all know that if we're probably going to continue like this, and the scientists are right, what we probably just have to assume, or should assume, and even if they're wrong, we might not want to risk it that they are right. Estimates of financial losses of easily 5% or more at the global level. So basically a hit to the worldwide GDP of at least 5% if global warming continues to increase until the end of the 21st century. Because we want to limit these negative effects, and governments more and more actively engage in counteracting climatic change. Because we all heard of COP21 in Paris 2015, where it was kind of an achievement that 195 nations agreed to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. I mean, I don't want to be too critical. Yeah, of course you can sign this, but then the question is, are the countries and the companies really just talking, or are they walking the walk? Yeah, but this is currently the statement, and countries are obliged, or at least to try, because we cannot guarantee that it will only be 2 degrees, but at least according to what scientists have said, there's a certain reduction required in carbon emissions to achieve that. What does that mean? Well, there will be a shift to a low carbon economy, but at the same time, this shift, of course, will require significant changes. First of all, it will require significant reductions in carbon emissions or overall greenhouse gas emissions. And it also means our entire economy probably has to change to become more green. What does this mean for companies and maybe the financial system? If we look at companies, there will be more and more mitigation policies, regulatory enforcement of emission reduction targets. And of course, that may challenge strategies of many businesses, especially those that are making an income from they're not making the income from polluting, but their business operations that provides them with the income typically goes hand in hand with high carbon emissions. So for those companies, it will probably become particularly difficult. There's more and more so-called divestment movements. For example, I've just mentioned one here, the Portfolio Decarbonization Coalition, that promotes divesting, basically removing funds from high carbon firms and rather invest in green companies. Of course, that is a huge threat in terms of economic performance of these dirty companies. Also, banks are starting to develop policies against financing brown business, dirty companies. In terms of, when I say dirty, I just mean in terms of their emissions. But of course, that means if your customers and are turning their back on you, if banks are not willing to finance anymore, maybe if investors are not willing to buy your shares anymore, there's a huge risk for companies. There's, as I mentioned, also a reputational risk for companies, but also for banks. In Australia, there's already a movement that many of our superannuation funds, our pension funds, should remove any investment from brown companies. So this will be difficult for polluters, and the technological progress and innovation may threaten existing technologies, of course, for example, fossil fuel-fired power plants, heavy polluting manufacturing businesses, and they might end up with stranded assets, basically assets they will not be able to use anymore, what will come at a high cost. If we look at the financial system, and just very briefly, I mean, there have been some studies suggesting that climate risk could possibly also have a huge impact on the financial system. There's a study by Weizsäcker in 2014 saying that, well, the EU financial system, the European Union, is estimated to be exposed by more than $1 trillion. And it could easily be potential losses of 350 to 400 billion, even under a soft landing scenario. Assets depending on cheap fossil fuels will be affected, including carbon and energy intensive sectors, transportation, manufacturing, agriculture, real estate. And we all know that financial markets are heavily connected nowadays. So that probably would mean if these firms drop significantly, we could easily see another, I mean, I wouldn't say global financial crisis, but something of that sort. Of course, we have to revalue assets in according with this policy, limiting global warming. That might have an overall impact on the stock market as well. Could easily fall up to 15 to 20%. Why is that? Because many of the dirty companies, you know, let's call them brown companies, will not make the profits they used to make. Yeah, and of course, if you think of the share price, in theory, we say this is nothing but the discounted value of future profits. If these future profits decline, the valuation will decline, and we might see losses in the stock market. There's also, I've seen there's some questions in the chat. I'll come to that. I'll just finish this slide. An initial shock could also trigger substantial second round effects, a contagion, as I mentioned. So other companies might be affected, and climate risk could even pose threaten the stability of financial markets. Okay, I'll have a look at the chat questions. Can we get the presentation material? Of course, I'm happy to send through these slides. Okay. All right, so we see significant risks or big risks to companies and maybe even the financial system. Sorry, I need to move over to my other screen. Okay, so let's have a quick look at some scientific studies here. Of course, there's been a rise in carbon trading and voluntary carbon disclosures, and I'll tell you much more about these voluntary carbon disclosures over the next hour. There's an increased demand for environmental disclosure by stakeholders, customers, investors, banks. Carbon emissions has been established as an additional risk factor in the financial literature. Because of these stranded assets, divestment, they call carbon bubbles, and their paper in the top finance and economics journals now dealing with this. It has become a very, very big area of research. While I can tell you, because I've been working in this area for a while, let's say 10 years ago, it was very, very difficult to get these papers published, because there wasn't such a strong interest. You had to go to more multidisciplinary journals and the Journal of Finance or top economic journals were not interested at all, but now it's really changed. This is, I mean, one of the, I'd say, biggest topics also in research, in financial and economic research, and it will probably remain like that for the next 10 years. So if you want to work in that area, I mean, I don't know, it could even be longer. I'm just saying, I don't think it will disappear anytime soon. Might also be for all researchers. It's probably a good area to work in. There's also expectation about positive relationship between voluntary disclosure. So companies are showing, yes, we're doing something in the climate change space, and actually environmental performance, and possibly also financial performance. So study by Tang and Demerit, 2018. And then there's studies that were looking at clean versus brown companies. In et al., in the Journal of Financial Economics, or Gergen et al., it's a working paper, but a very, very nice one, who showed that better financial performance of clean or reporting companies should be driven by changes in the preference of investors. And some of these studies have shown that clean companies have performed better than brown companies. As someone has the microphone on and I'm getting a bit of feedback, not sure, so maybe turn the microphone off, because I can hear myself coming back through my microphone. Just saying. Okay, so motivation. This is all nice and sounds very interesting. So we would expect, it's quite clear, green companies. I can still unfortunately hear some noise. So maybe everyone should be on mute. It's probably easier. Okay, so these, yeah, now it's better. So these studies would suggest that green companies will do much better than brown companies. But interestingly, I've been working in this area for a little bit, and it's not necessarily what you always find empirically. So we did a study at holdings of different investor groups that has now been published in Business Strategy and the Environment, international journal in that field, where basically we found that investor holdings haven't really changed. Yeah, people are talking about it, but it didn't seem like investors were really moving from brown companies to clean companies or green companies. So that was kind of a disappointing study, but as I said here, it finishes in 2016, and maybe in the last 5-6 years a lot has happened. We did a parallel study to the one I'm talking about today, where we looked at the future financial performance of companies that are disclosing. Also here, we didn't really find a significant effect. It didn't seem like that those who are trying to disclose very well and give it more effort were performing better financially. What does mean financial performance? Well, we looked at the stock market, their valuation on the stock market. And we didn't really find a difference between those who were getting a bad score and a good score from this carbon disclosure project. Then there's another study that is very much related to ours. And it's by Fabrizio and Kim. It's a very beautiful piece of work. They're also using text mining techniques, and they're suggesting that companies that actually have bad news to disclose, basically in terms of their environmental performance, they use so-called, they call it linguistic obfuscation in their information disclosure. Basically, they are hiding behind nice words, trying to reveal the truth. Yeah, so they aim to manage the tension between the pressure of actually having to disclose and the desire to project a positive image. So they want to have a positive image, they're disclosing, but the reality is not so good. Yeah, so they're kind of doing impression management, or, well, I don't want to say lying, but almost, it's very close to lying. Okay, so these studies kind of contradict what we've seen before. Yeah, so before we thought it's all good, you have to be clean to be successful, and so on. But in reality, the world is not necessarily like that yet. Yeah. So what do we want to do? We want to have another look to examine the relationship between these carbon disclosures, and the environmental performance, the actual environmental performance of these companies. And then we also, on top of just using these scores, we're creating a new score from these reports. And we call this an impression management or impression score. So basically, we're measuring how much are these companies trying to hide the truth, or maybe writing too positive while they're actually not doing so positively. And this is basically the key aim of this study. Okay, so where does it come from? Well, overall, we're just saying, okay, there's carbon trading, carbon tax, measurement of carbon emissions. Whatever can get measured can also be managed, possibly. So now companies are more and more forced to voluntarily disclose. Yeah? It's funny, forced to voluntarily disclose, but in some sense, there's peer pressure. And then we are asking, well, we would think there would be a positive effect. If you disclose, if you measure, you will also manage and you might do better. But is this really the case? And are companies maybe playing some tricks on this disclosure quality? This is basically what we're looking at. Okay, and now I'll talk a little bit, and I'll probably keep that short because you can read it in the paper. I will send the paper to Rudi, and hopefully you will be able to distribute it. You can read a bit more about these disclosure theories in the paper, but I'll keep it relatively short. Yeah, so the first one is the so-called outside-in view. It's a positive view. So the idea is that stakeholders will communicate with the companies, and the companies will disclose, because there is public pressure on them to talk about their carbon emissions and to do something about it. But then as I said, if they look into it, they measure it, and maybe they will also manage their carbon emissions better. Because of course we will all think, if we start thinking about or looking into something and our performance in that space, it may well be that it will also improve our performance. Yeah, that basically it will reduce carbon emissions just because we're disclosing, we're looking, we're measuring our performance, we're managing the performance, and will improve. Yeah, and there's a few studies, for example, Burrit and Schaltegger, they really looked at this carbon disclosure project and suggested sorry, Kian and Schaltegger 2013-17, that basically thorough disclosure led to a reduction of carbon emission intensity in future years. And this is kind of, I'd say, what we would expect. But funnily enough, all three theories that you will see make somehow sense. I mean, this is the nice view. Companies are kind of forced to do something about it. They will improve. Carbon emissions will go down, in a nutshell. The second view is not so positive. It's called the legitimacy view. So basically, again, there's peer pressure on the companies, but they only disclose to conform. Yeah, so this concept of legitimacy, but basically what's the idea? Well, firms will act to maintain, let's say, their reputation or their legitimacy by changing their output and operations to conform to expectations of the public. But this disclosure in this case is not, so they don't take this positive view that we've seen from the outside in view. So they're saying, well, just because they're looking into it and reporting, that doesn't necessarily mean that their performance will improve. This is more like a box ticking. So they are forced to disclose, and then they demonstrate that they adhere to social norms and regulations. They will publish their disclosure, but they will not do anything about it, really. Yeah. Corporate disclosure through mandatory reporting schemes. Also, some study found it didn't really improve the environmental performance. Yeah, this study by Matisov 2013. Or another study investigated a multi-year sample of global scope, and they observed that worse environmental performance was actually preceded by increased disclosure. Yeah, so in this case, the more the companies were complying with the disclosure requirement, the worse they did afterwards. Yeah. But that's this view that disclosure is assumed to be a legitimacy tool, and it doesn't really mean that it will really have a positive impact on the performance. Of course, it's a much less positive view on the world. Some people might say it's a more realistic view. We are not sure. Yeah, hopefully you would improve through this through the outside-in view, but maybe companies are really just using it because, or disclosing because they have to, and they're not really changing their behavior that much. Then there's that goes in a similar direction. Yeah, it's the greenwashing view. We say, well, there's pressure from organizational outsiders, banks, investors, customers that will affect this disclosure. But it will not bring forward complete, true or unbiased information. So companies may only disclose because they kind of have to, or to avoid a closer examination by the public. So the view here is, yes, we'll disclose, we'll report about our environmental and climate performance to avoid that they look deeper into it. Yeah, that's kind of discretionary environmental reporting. Companies are free to really share what they want. Yeah, unless there's a, I mean, if we really measure the carbon emissions of every company, they cannot play their tricks. But we're looking at voluntary carbon disclosure, so they are free to disclose what they want. And of course, they might just provide selective information to the outside world. So there could be an opportunistic motive that will serve as impression management, which will basically introduce a strategic bias into the reporting. They will report positive things and be silent about negative things. Or emphasize good news, bad news are obfuscated, are hidden, or written in nice words, but not really writing the truth. And there's this study, as I mentioned, by Fabrizio and Kim that goes a little bit into this direction. Yeah, they say those who have actually bad news to report, they write more, they report, and to reduce the negative impact of their lower CDP score. Okay, so 3 views. We are, as I said, creating 2 different measures. We are using the scores that are provided by the Carbon Disclosure Project, and I'll talk much more about that in the next couple of minutes. But we're also creating our own score, what we call impression score, that is basically a greenwashing score. Yeah. So if the outside-in view is true, we would think those who get a higher score, yeah, CDP, T, this is basically the score they're getting from the Carbon Disclosure Project. And the better the score, the more we would think the better will be their corporate environmental performance. Yeah, so we say good score, better performance. If the legitimacy view is true, they're just doing it kind of to tick the box. Yeah, to justify the license of operations and to give in to the social pressure, then we would say, well, the higher the Carbon Disclosure Project score, it might not have an effect on the actual environmental performance. Or maybe we would even see a worse one. Probably, we don't know, but definitely not a better one. Here we would think they're really taking it seriously, or it will change their operations, better management, lower carbon emissions, or better environmental performance. Here we don't know. Here, remember we're having a different score, an impression management score, and we would say, well, the more they're using this impression management, or the worse will be their environmental performance. Yeah, so here they're really playing a trick. So we have 3 hypotheses, and we'll test all 3 of them. The first 2 ones, we will just use the Carbon Disclosure Project score. And for this one, we will use our new score that we've developed. Okay, now I'll talk a little bit about the Carbon Disclosure Project. This is a not-for-profit charity that started in 2000. They're running this global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions to manage the environmental impact. And here, this is their mission statement. We focus investors, companies, and cities on taking urgent action to build a truly sustainable economy by measuring and understanding the environmental impact. It was founded in 2000 as an international association of investors, and the numbers of companies that are reporting has recently really grown exponentially. You will see in our study, I think we only had 6,000 companies reporting in 2019. If you look at the 2021 numbers, there were 14,000 organizations. 13,000 of them were companies. These companies cover far more than half of the global market capitalization of all companies. So that means all major, not all major, but most of the major companies are disclosing. There's also 1,100 cities that are disclosing. And the peer pressure on all companies and cities and states is now so high that more and more are participating in this exercise. The Carbon Disclosure Project says that neither themselves nor the scoring partners are actually verifying the information that is disclosed by the individual companies. And now you could say, of course, this is based on trust. But remember, when we think of greenwashing, well, if it's not really verified, you can probably write it. I mean, you don't want to outright lie because that might come out, but maybe you can play a little bit of with impression management and make it look better than it actually is. But of course, they advise everyone who participates in the disclosing to provide accurate responses. Now it's actually very smart, the concept. So they have so-called, the Carbon Disclosure Project has so-called investor signatories. Yeah, these are huge investment funds or investors. They basically pay for the disclosure information. Yeah, so the CDP collects the disclosure from the companies and the cities and the states, and then provides these to their signatories, to the investors. But the investors basically fund the whole thing. Well, now think of it that way. There's also pressure on the investors, of course, to participate in this scheme, because more and more of us individual investors who are giving our money to funds, maybe we also want to invest in green companies. So they have a strong interest in finding out what the companies are disclosing. Yeah. And then it's interesting. So these signatory investors, what are they getting in return? Well, the critical information. They are regularly updated on the disclosure period or on disclosures of specific companies they're interested in. They can also say, look, we are very interested in this and that company. And then the Carbon Disclosure Project will start a so-called global non-disclosure campaign to encourage the company that the investors are interested in to disclose. Yeah, basically they will shame them. They say, these guys are not disclosing. And then they start a campaign. And of course, most companies, in terms of their reputation, have to give in and will then participate. And maybe because the CDP is such a big and well-established initiative, they have power. Yeah, they can, I'm not saying they can force, but they can put a lot of pressure on companies to really disclose. That's why also these numbers have gone up so much. And then the signatories are also getting access to current historical company questionnaire responses, and they get access to all the CDP scores. Yeah, so basically they pay, and in return they're getting the information and potentially support with putting pressure on the companies to really disclose. So how does it work? Yeah, here's the CDP. Here are the signatories or the information requesters or informing requesters. So basically the CDP then contacts the companies, sends them a questionnaire. The company will return the questionnaire. It will be, or maybe it could start with a disclosure request by the investors. Then this will go through CDP. Yeah, and then CDP publishes the data for markets and also academics. And you can buy that information. They're not cheap, but remember, it's a not-for-profit organization. So they are not trying to make money like the rating agencies. If you think of Standard & Poor's or Moody's that are also doing ratings for companies, but here they're not doing ratings, they're doing disclosure, yeah, in terms of environmental performance. The rating agencies are trying to make money, but the process is very similar, yeah, because the rating agencies also don't charge necessarily. Well, it depends. They charge for some ratings, but not for all of them. But then they sell the data, and it's kind of similar here. Okay, how does this questionnaire look like? Well, there is like an introduction, then there's a section on governance, risk and opportunities, the strategy, emissions methodology, data breakdown, energy, carbon pricing, engagement, and basically the idea is so the companies are reporting on their performance, on their strategy, and it's all related to climate, yeah, or environmental performance. I've just seen there's another question. Oh no, okay. Okay, just about the attendance form. Okay, that doesn't impact on me. Okay, so and what's the idea of the CDP? As I said before, create awareness through disclosure, help improve climate change management because the companies are forced to disclose, to probably and then measure and possibly better manage, And of course, CDP also wants to provide information about climate risks and low carbon opportunities. Yeah, so it's not just the threat to these companies that they are being shamed or get a bad score. It is also about really helping to see low carbon opportunities and risks of climate. Okay, so just to give you an idea, as I said, it was already 14,000 or 13,000 companies in 2021. Our sample was not that big. You can see in 2003, very, very small number of companies only reported. So the blue numbers or the blue bars refer to the number of companies that have reported. The gray bars refer to the companies that were targeted, basically where the questionnaires were sent to. You can see in the beginning, a lot of them didn't respond. Yeah, like for example, 2006, or let me put it differently. Sorry, I should say that again. So it's not in the beginning. In the beginning, the response rate was actually rather a bit higher. But why is that? Because in the beginning, probably those companies that were willing to disclose were the ones who were really worried about environmental performance. Yeah, maybe the good companies that wanted to achieve something. Then this project became more and more important, and there was more and more peer pressure on companies, and then you can see the response rate. So CDP became much bigger, they targeted far more companies, but then the response rate here went down to like 35% for some time. And then it started to increase back to almost 60%. And why is that? Well, of course, because the peer pressure or the pressure on companies to disclose has become bigger and bigger. Now investors are interested, we as customers are interested, the government is interested, so it's very hard to say no and no, we're not going to disclose. So this I don't have the numbers for 2020 and 2021, but I expect them that the response rate is now probably more like around 70–80%, because this pressure has continuously risen. Okay, so now there's a question. What's the benefit for a company if they were carbon disclosing? Does the government give incentive for those? Okay, so the government, yes and no. I mean, what's the benefit? Well, you're showing that you're doing something about climate change, yeah? Because you have this report, you will get a score. If your score is good, you can put that on your website, and I'll show that in a minute, that you're a leader in climate change. Or in managing your environmental performance. So there's a lot to win. But then if you're really doing badly, then there's also quite a bit to lose. And so one benefit is if you're doing well, you will get a high score, and that's something that will be appreciated by investors, by banks, by governments, by customers. If you're not doing so well, you might still use this to what we call do impression management. Yeah, you write a positive report. You hope you will get away with it, and at least you can say, yes, we are participating in this voluntary disclosure. We're doing something about climate change. Yeah, so there's many things for companies to that give them the benefit, and of course they might also be forced, because if there's a campaign, you need to disclose, and there are these signatory investors or signatories of the project who are huge funds, huge investment companies. They can put pressure on the companies. Yeah? But there are benefits and risks, of course, of disclosing. But as I said, more and more companies are really participating here, because it's very hard. You can almost not afford anymore to claim. Let's say 10–15 years ago, you could have probably said, climate change, this is overrated, blah, blah, blah. Yeah? But I don't think anybody can dare to say that anymore, because it's been established as a fact. There will be climatic change as a risk, and something needs to be done about it. So there's a lot of pressure on companies to disclose. Okay, now let's look at the score, and maybe I'll just jump one further. So the companies provide these reports, and I didn't I'll send with the materials. I send 2 example reports. I have one from Apple and one from an energy company here in Australia, AGL. So basically, you're getting the score from A, that's the best, to D. Yeah, and then they say, well, the pathway is kind of D is the lowest score. Okay, and then there's also F if you don't respond. Yeah, then you're getting a F, failure to disclose. D means you've just started to disclose, you're not doing so well. C means you're at the awareness level, you're starting to do something about it, or you have, according to your disclosure, you're trying to do better. B means you're really managing your emissions, and A is like a leadership level. You're kind of a global leader in managing your carbon emissions. And it's very important to understand, this doesn't mean that clean companies will get an A and dirty companies will get a D. Yeah, it's more about how well you report and how much the Carbon Disclosure Project gets the impression that you are really doing something about reducing your emissions. So you could be an energy company with relatively high emissions, but if you're really doing something, moving more to renewables and having a lot of other initiatives, you might still get an A. And that's very important. So this score is not measuring the emissions. It's measuring how much companies are participating in this disclosure project. And they don't tell us exactly how the scoring methodology works. But basically the score is based on the level of detail and comprehensiveness of the content of your disclosure, the organization's awareness of climate change. There's also water and forest issues, but I'm not talking so much about that, about the management methods for climate change initiatives, and progress towards actionable change. Yeah, so it's always relative. How have you done before and what are you doing now? And that is very important to understand. Yeah, so A, not necessarily clean companies, D, not necessarily dirty companies, but companies that are making a good impression according to the report in terms of how much do they really invest into knowing about climatic change and their emissions. How are they managing it? Are they improving, at least according to their report? And are they not just writing, but are they also making progress towards action? That's what the Carbon Disclosure Project says. Okay, then there's this, and just very briefly, so overall, CDP is an information intermediary. Yeah, by collecting the carbon disclosure information, aggregating it, providing a rating, and then giving this information to outsiders, investors, or you and I, all of us could just try to buy the data or access some of these reports. Scores enable industry-based benchmarking. Scores also reflect the detail and completeness of disclosure, corporations' awareness, and then every year they publish an A list. That means remember A, you showing leadership on that front, and companies really put that on their website. Yeah, so this has become an important score. If you're on the A list, I think Sidney is on the A list, this is announced. Yeah, so more and more companies want to be on that A list. So they are hiring consultants to do these disclosure reports. It has become a bit of a game. Okay, so yeah, and there's many other studies related to these CDP scores, but they're not doing what we are doing. Yeah, so there's a study looking at how did financial markets respond to when the disclosure, the scores were published. There's a study, and that I find that very interesting. It doesn't seem like that if companies are dirty, it doesn't seem to matter whether they disclose or not. They will still be, they will have a negative impact on pricing. no matter whether they disclose or not. Yeah, this is Griffin et al. Then some found a positive relationship between green innovation companies and carbon disclosure. So companies that are really doing something are more likely to disclose and are more likely to get better scores. People looked at gender diversity on boards and found kind of the more women were on boards, the more likely were the companies to disclose better and also get higher scores. People looked at the institutional context and the relationship between disclosure and emissions, relationship between the quality of CDP reports and the carbon performance. This is a study that is kind of similar to ours, but they're not creating an impression score. And then people have looked at the national culture and how that impacts on carbon disclosure, and many, many more. But we're looking, remember, scores, environmental performance, impression management, environmental performance. Okay, just very briefly. So you see that that more than 50% of the companies got a score of A and B. Yeah, here 51.86% either had a score of A and B. A was like 8%, then A minus 20%, A minus 10.6%, B 31%, and B minus 1.5%. And then a few of them got bad scores. Yeah, but overall, relatively good scores. Okay, now I'll talk about impression management. Okay, remember I was talking about greenwashing, and the idea is here basically, are they trying to hide or obfuscate bad news by reading ease manipulation? Yeah, maybe they're writing the reports in a way that they're very difficult to read. Do they focus more on good news by thematic manipulation? And we create 3 measures of text analysis. Yeah, so we're using text mining techniques or computer-aided text analysis. And there's really nice R and Python packages that you can use to do that. So we're downloading all these reports. Yeah, in total, we have 14,300 reports, and then we're running them, or we programmed the analysis, and we're getting different scores for this impression management. Of course, we also had the scores from the Carbon Disclosure Project, but they don't play a role here. So we are trying to find something else that is more dedicated to greenwashing, or what we call impression management. Yeah. So what 3 measures are we using? One is the tone. Yeah, and there's some studies have suggested that if reports are overwhelmingly positive or use overwhelmingly positive words and less negativity, then they're trying harder to do impression management. Yeah, and then there's a study, for example, by Lyon and Maxwell saying, well, the firms that can afford to disclose more negative aspects typically also have more credible reports. Yeah, so we're looking at, are there too many positive words in comparison to the negative words? We call that the tone. And now, of course, the world has really moved on, because I think 10, 20 years ago, it would have been very difficult to do that analysis for 14,000 reports. But there's a so-called dictionary, yeah, of positive and negative words created by Logarithm and McDonald. So we use that dictionary. Basically, we just have a list of these words, and then we go through the reports and we count the words. Yeah, the positive ones versus the negative ones. And then we take care of if, if the negative or positive words are negated, because you have to be careful. Someone could say not polluting. Yeah, then of course that's more like a positive word. But if it's just polluting or whatever, it would be sorry, not polluting would be positive, but if it's polluting, it would just be negative. See, there's another question. Thanks for the answer. Oh yeah, okay, was just yeah. Okay, so tone. Are they overly positive? Are they trying to hide something? Yeah, or now I mean, it's not the perfect measure, but some people in the literature have just suggested if a report contains too many positive words, that is critical. Okay, the other thing is the readability. Yeah, and generally people suggest the easier it is to read, the clearer will be the report. And a lot of firms have been trying to hide behind less readable reports. Yeah. And there's a paper by Muslo et al. Suggesting that good performers are assumed to increase transparency to signal what they're doing. Yeah, so basically we are using a readability score. And again, that has been developed before, of course. We're suggesting that firms with more readable CDP reports are not trying to hide something. Their reports can be considered more transparent and therefore of higher quality. Okay, and then we're just using this SMOC. It's a standard measure of readability. It's called simple measure of gobbledygook. Gobbledygook is just a nonsense word. And basically what this score does, it looks at the sentence length, average syllables per word, proportion of polysyllabic words, and the more complex the report is, the more we're claiming that probably companies are trying to hide something or do greenwashing. That's our second score. And finally, we're looking at the length, and we believe that companies that write more probably are giving it more effort. But then, and I don't want to go too much into detail because it's already 3:10. So basically, we're just checking, are they we're adjusting it for how complicated their report was. And so it's basically like a measure that takes into account the SMOC score, remember SMOC readability score, and the length of the text. And then we have another measure of performance. So we have the tone, that is like positivity, is it overly positive? Then we have the readability. Is it incredibly difficult to read that report, so they are trying to hide something? And then we take the length. And these are our three measures. And then we're just saying, basically, each company or each report gets a score. We're sorting them from 0 to 1. And then basically we're creating the more positive, the less readable, and the shorter, then they would get a high score. Yeah, that means too much positivity, less readable, and less extensive. So the higher the score, the more they are trying to do this impression management. Or you could also say the more they are trying to do greenwashing. Yeah? Okay. And here's just the summary again. Yeah, greenwashing tendencies by the tone, obfuscation in intent by writing it overly complicated, and the length, keeping it very short, not providing any information really. Okay, the higher the score, the worse we would expect the environmental performance to be. Okay, and now we're testing basically 3 models. Yeah, and I should, and I'll also go through that quickly. How are we measuring environmental performance? Or we're just taking the carbon intensity of company. So basically, I'll tell you in a minute, or maybe I should say that first here. Basically, carbon emission intensity can be, we have a database, Refinitiv, that tells you the scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And then we measure the emission intensity by dividing the emissions by the sales. Yeah, you need some measure of size because, of course, big companies are polluting more. And then just to, I don't know whether everyone knows that scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions are the emissions that a company releases as a direct result of an activity or series of activities at a facility level. And then there's scope 2, but we really have to also include scope 2. These are the emissions released through indirect consumption, for example, of energy. Yeah, I mean, if you use a lot of electricity for your business, that should also be included. Yeah, so indirect emissions come from the use of electricity produced by the burning of coal or whatever. So direct emissions plus scope 2 emissions, and then we divide it by their sales, and this gives us the carbon emission intensity. So, and if a company improves the environmental performance, we would hope that the emission intensity goes down. So what are we measuring? Changes in the carbon emission intensity. And then we relate this to their CDP score. Yeah, are they leaders? or are they losers in terms of the CDP project score. We're relating these carbon emission intensities also to impression management score. And then in the third model, we're using both of them. And then we have control variables like the firm size, the leverage. I mean, this is just the typical variables you normally use in those models, because of course, size might have a stronger effect than what we can measure with our scores. Are the companies highly leveraged? What's their return on asset? Are they growing? And so on. And then we have these so-called fixed effects, country fixed effects, industry fixed effects, and year fixed effects, to also control for different industries, to control for different countries, and so on. This is just standard in, let's say, in economic or financial models to add these dummy variables in some sense. Okay, very briefly. Most of the companies are in the US, and then the UK, and 4% Australian, and so on. As I said, we have like 14,000 reports to analyze. Interestingly, overall, and that's the only thing I'll say about this slide, carbon emission intensity has gone up. We wouldn't have thought that, because you would think, but throughout our sample period, it has gone up. I'll leave it at that. Our variables are not highly correlated. You just want to test. I mean, I'll only say one thing. And this is from t to t+1. That's why the matrix is not symmetric. But we don't get a very high correlation between the CDP score and the impression score. And this is very important for us, because we don't want to repeat what the Carbon Disclosure Project is already doing with their score. We are really creating something different that tells us about how much is the company trying to greenwash, or maybe use impression management. Okay. Also here, very quickly, it just seems like the scores have been getting better. Look here, very, very few companies got an A. If we look at it now, much higher share. And as I said before, A and B is now by far more than 50%. Overall in the sample, it was around 50%. But recently in 2019, it was more like, I'll put that together, probably 2/3. So what does that mean? Either the companies have really been improving, or they have just been improving in their reports. And as you will see, the results suggest that it's the second thing. Okay, now just very quickly, again, now we're looking at the carbon emission intensity. And remember, I said it's not like that the clean companies get an A and the dirty companies get a D. And if you look at this, this is the median of their emission intensity. Well, you might think that the A ranked maybe have a little bit of a lower carbon emission intensity, but there's nothing really that significant. Yeah, so that's important to understand. A does not necessarily mean that it's the clean companies, and D are not only the dirty companies. It almost seems like the B companies have a little bit of a higher carbon emission intensity than the D, but A is a little bit better. And here are the ones that are missing, but they also are not, they didn't get a score, they didn't report. There's no clear tendency here. But then we're looking at the change in carbon emission intensity. And now what would we hope to see? Well, a declining trend here. Yeah, those that get an A, we would hope are really improving, reducing their carbon emission intensity. And those who get a D, we would think maybe they're not reducing their carbon emissions that much. But if you look at it here, 0, I mean, it almost seems like the D ones are even doing better than the B ones and maybe the A ones. It's very hard to see, but there's clearly not a striking effect. Yeah, so the rating does not mean that they will definitely do so much better. And now we're really doing, I mean, this is just, I like to have a view at or look at the performance first, because you would like to see it also in the graph. If you can't see it in the graph, well, maybe you will still get it as a significant effect in the regression, and that's what we're looking at now. Okay, so results. Remember, the higher the score, the better we would hope that these companies are performing. But better performance means that their carbon emission intensity should go down. And what do we get? Predominantly, we're getting a positive sign. So that means the higher the score, the more they have actually increased their emission intensity, the worse was their environmental performance. Yeah, so companies with an A on average had a 0.034% higher carbon emission intensity the next year in comparison to companies with a B score or whatever. Yeah, so the higher the score, the worse their environmental performance, or the change in their environmental performance, the worse in the next year. And that's a very weird result. So that would suggest that they're really just reporting because they have to. And it doesn't really mean much to get an A, doesn't mean much to get a B, but it also doesn't mean much to get a D, as it really comes to the environmental performance. Then an A would just mean they're reporting well, but it doesn't tell us anything about their performance. Yeah? The higher the score, the worse the performance. Very sad result in that sense. Then we're looking at the impression score. Remember here we're saying the higher the score, the more they're trying to lie or use this, the more they're trying to greenwash. The more they're trying to greenwash, the more we're probably expecting them to perform bad in the next year. Now our results are not super significant, yeah, just at the 10% level, but at least here we're getting the expected sign. Yeah, the more they're using impression management, the worse is their performance in the next year. And the less they're trying to hide something, the less will be the positive effect, or maybe even a negative effect on the carbon emissions. Yeah. So greenwashing, clear signs, and here just something that I cannot really explain or that I would not expect. The better the CDP score, the worse the environmental performance in the next year. If we put the two together, the CDP score is still slightly significant, but our impression management score still positive, but you can see at the T statistics, not significant, but we take it, it's still there, but not in a significant manner. Okay, so what does that mean? This outside-in management view is not supported. Yeah, it doesn't seem to help that if companies are getting a very good CDP score, if they are disclosing well, that is not an indication of a better environmental performance. So it's probably more like this legitimacy view or theory. They're disclosing because they have to, but it doesn't really tell anything about their future environmental performance. We even find that per unit of CDP score, it increases 3.4% carbon emission intensity in the next year. For the impression management, we also find this positive effect, what we were expecting. So there's some evidence for impression management and greenwashing for firms prior to poor environmental performance. That seems like those that know that in the next year they will not have they will increase their emissions. They're trying very, very hard to write a nice report, yeah, with a lot of positive words, positively complicated words, and well, not a nice report, but short with many more positive words and more complicated. Okay, then we did a couple of oh yeah, I'll leave this out. I'll just jump to the next slide. We did a couple of robustness checks, but I'll keep this short. Overall, it seemed like this effect became more significant in the later periods. What would say maybe in the beginning it was really companies that were reporting more honestly, and now it has become more and more of a game. But that's of course a very sad message. Yeah. Then we were also looking at companies like energy companies, and seems like they were doing less of the impression management. We were looking at how strict are the countries in terms of protecting stakeholders. The stricter the countries, the less impression management seems to be happening. Also, if there's a national emissions trading scheme, the impression management and the CDP scores are less significant. So overall, the result is more like it has become stronger recently. And the more enforcement there is, the less the companies are playing the game. Yeah. And I'll just summarize here. High carbon disclosure scores do not seem to provide any evidence for better environmental performance. No outside-in view, legitimacy view. They're just doing it because they have to. And then they're even trying to game these scores. Yeah, we find some evidence of impression management and greenwashing. As I said, it has increased recently. And the less regulation there is, the more opportunistic reporting is happening. And now, of course, if you summarize this, it means this whole voluntary disclosure exercise doesn't really seem to achieve too much. And I think that is, on the one hand, a sad message, but at the same time, it's also an important message, because it means if governments really want to do something about it, probably they should have a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme or something they can really measure, because you cannot rely on these reports, because these reports are more of a game, it seems like, for the companies. Yeah. Okay, I'll stop here. As I said, it's not a very inspiring outcome, but sometimes the world is just a bit of a bad place, and I think we found that again. Yeah. And now there was another question that I'll just answer, and then I'll have a few more minutes to take additional questions. Okay, the result that is not as expected. Is it possible that the sample may influence the result? I mean, that the sample is not really appropriate to address. Well, it's tricky. I mean, remember, we have a huge sample, and we did a little bit more, but I left that out. I mean, there could also be a self-selection bias, but we did some, it's called the Heckman correction to correct for that. We did a lot of robustness checks, and I'm afraid these results are just what it is. Yeah, the CDP score is not a meaningful measure for future environmental performance, and some companies are really trying to play a game through greenwashing. So I'm kind of convinced, because we really tried a lot of different models, and because we didn't want to find this really, we were thinking we would find something else. But no matter what we tried, it was either insignificant or pointed rather into the wrong direction. Okay, any more questions? Chat, or you can turn on your microphone now, I guess, whatever you prefer. I'm sorry, I don't have nicer news for the world.
Okay, if there is any more question, you can talk to Stefan directly through your microphone.
Don't be shy. And as I said, I will be happy to send the working paper and example reports if anyone is interested. I'm not allowed to send you the data.
So about the data, Stefan, do you think is it possible to do the same research for the case of Indonesia? I mean that maybe you have looked at many data set, and maybe you find that, oh, there's also data on Indonesia.
I haven't, I admit, I was actually planning to at least have a look how many Indonesian companies were part of it, but I forgot. And then I was running out of time, so I can't say. Of course, it would be interesting to maybe even structure it by countries, yeah? Or like, I mean, we have these country fixed effects, but I haven't really looked at which country was particularly dishonest or anything like that. Yeah, I don't know. So we didn't do that.
Yeah. Yes, you say that even the available data may be not very reliable because they're, like you said, companies may be playing games in reporting their carbon emission, and also
well, not in terms of the emissions, because they can't really normally fake that, yeah, because it's measured, and then they would be outright lying. But they are reporting, you know, through in a fluffy way, using nice words. I mean, think of it in a bit of the difference between qualitative and quantitative measures. I mean, quantitative measures are more like facts. Qualitative, you can always game the system somehow. Yeah. And as the question here, is it more a subjective answer from the respondents? Yeah, of course. There's no objective clear measure here. Even though the CDP, they have a process how they get their score, but they're not really revealing that. But I think it's a very objective way of measuring what companies are doing. I think the facts, and that is probably the lesson to learn here, it makes probably much more sense to forget about this stuff and just implement a clear scheme that measures the carbon emissions. And have a look how the company is really performing. There's a question here, Tegu Santoso. You raised your hand. You want to ask a question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for Professor Stefan. And to be honest, I'm really interested with the topic. And one small question is how to minimize the subjective bias from respondent when they answer the survey or something like that, because I think as you said before that they are required to answer all of questions due to specific requirements, but they are not really think about that is really happen related with the carbon emission maybe. Therefore, they tend to put high score or the lower score. It is depend on the scaling maybe. Thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah. And I mean, look, you can't blame the CDP because they have good intentions, but of course they cannot check everything and see through that. So they have their way of providing the score, and that is more based on how much other companies participating in this disclosure project. But the reality often is different, because the reality in some sense should be about how much are they really emitting, and just as you said, and are they really reducing their emission intensity and their carbon footprint. Any more questions?
That's enough. Thank you, Professor.
Sorry?
Just enough.
I think there's one more question. Some more call. You're on mute at the moment. Okay, yeah.
Yes, Professor, thank you for giving me a chance. And actually, I'm a little bit confused to understand all the material because it's not my field, but I try to catch up step by step. My thesis or my actually it's about investment, but with the theory of marketing and communication or promotion to attract investor. So I just learned about the sustainability investment because for example now government like invite investor to develop area or destination in tourism area. So how about is there any comment about the sustainability investment standard, for examples, or because that destination, it's already become sustainable tourism destination since the investor, because what is it? The awareness of the investor about sustainability investment, I think, should be encouraged from the academician, media, and the other pentaholics. So even though they have money, so they have to understand also about the sustainability in the destination.
Oh, but I'm sure investors care about that. But I mean, let's face it, who of us, when we invest, really looks at the emissions and then does the calculations and compares it to other companies? I think we're relying on things like these scores, yeah, because we would hope that someone else does it for us. It's the same as it comes to credit risk. We're relying on rating agencies, yeah, because I mean, who would find their way through all the financial reports and then really come up with a good measure? We're just relying on the fact that the rating agencies are providing a good, doing a good job, and that the rating is reliable. And I think this is something similar, but I can from this study say it's probably not so good to rely on these disclosure scores, because they are not particularly meaningful. And there needs to be other measures that are provided and possible if you have access to the right databases, changes in emission intensities and so on. The hard facts will probably drive or tell you a bit more about the companies and their efforts in sustainability.
Very much, Professor.
Stefan, I think
we have to stop.
Yeah, we should stop now,
yeah.
Because
okay, yeah.
Time's up. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry for going a little bit over time, and thanks for all the interesting questions. As I said, I'll provide the material.
Yeah. You can send the matter to me, and then I will circulate.
I will do that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you for a very good presentation. This is actually
thanks so much for everyone for participating, and I guess I'll see you in April or May for part 2, and there is a bit of a more positive story.
There will be a part 2 of this webinar, maybe in April or May. Yeah, okay. That is a very interesting presentation, because this topic is quite new here in Indonesia, which you actually have been doing that for about 10 years, and there are many related issues that would be very interesting to be a research topic. It's like does this disclosure really valuable for the company, because they are also they also seek to give a good quality, give the true report, not good. The report must be good, but the question is that really good? Also there's a gender issue, which you mentioned, that women actually more likely to report rather than men, but we don't know the quality. It's just like the likelihood of to report. Okay, there are many issues, and I think we will meet again in April, Stefan. And thank you for all the participants, and we hope that you all can participate in the next webinar. Stefan, after this we have a business meeting with the dean and the dean of the.
Yes, I think I'll just stop and join the other meeting that has been, because I got an invitation.
Yeah. You can join the break room.
Okay. Thanks so much to everyone. As I said, I'll provide my details. Feel free to send me an email or comments, or if you have questions. I might not be able to respond quickly, but then if you don't hear from me, send me a reminder, and I'm very happy to answer questions also through email. It was great. Thanks so much to everyone for participating. Bye.